focusing today on one on planning. And Gideon, why don't you walk us through some of the things that we found out? Gideon Smitton is a senior researcher here at the British Market Foundation.
Sure. So as Jamie said, this is the end of a 5-part series on housing policy. The goal of the project was to look at housing policy across the English. We wanted to understand how English-speaking countries, how much was shared in the housing problems that they face, and how much can we learn. We tend to think that we're in our own unique housing crisis. Everyone thinks that they have a uniquely terrible situation. We wanted to see how much of that was true and how much we could learn. We split it into 4 different themes as well as an introduction. If you're at all interested in other topics, they include homeownership, renting, alternatives like social housing and co-op housing, as well as this one, planning reform. So to go into planning reform, to begin, I thought it would be useful to define what we mean, which is important because planning reform is a very vague term. We tend to talk about it a lot, but it's the equivalent of saying, improve the NHS, improve service delivery. To start with, we wanted to define how we wanted to see planning reform around the world. We define it as policies that would increase capacity. Again, it's so vague, but policies that would allow people to build more on the same land that they were already looking. That can include changes to zoning practices if you work in a country that zones. In the UK, it could mean permanent development rights, fast-tracking approvals, changing design codes and local planning authority guidance, or any number of other topics. The point of planning reform is largely twofold. Firstly, you want to increase supply of homes. The idea being housing is currently constrained by regulations. If you liberalize those regulations, supply could increase. The second element flows through that, saying if you increase supply, prices will fall in simple, economic terms. Unleash the power of the private market, as it were, and prices will fall. So we decided to look at both of those in turn. Firstly, does planning reform necessarily increase supply? And secondly, does that increased supply, if it comes through, decrease prices, or at least restrain them below those? I'm going to split what I'm saying into both of those sections. So firstly, on supply, it's important to note the constraints to planning reform. Planning reform cannot create houses where there is not demand for them. If you increase the capacity on a lot for development that is not in demand in that area, you're not going to increase it. That's not bad necessarily. We want to be increasing supply where it's wanted, but it's important to keep in mind in certain areas it's not going to help. The other element that doesn't impact is any private sector misuse of the system. So I'm not sure how many of you saw the CMA report this spring, but it came out saying that many private sector builders are building houses at a rate intentionally kept low so that they can be sold without reducing prices. Again, planning reform does not necessarily help with that. It may in the form of increasing the capacity to build, but it doesn't directly impact them. In the rest of the areas we looked at, a lot of different countries have looked at planning reform. It's usually done at a city level, but it's sometimes done at a state level if you're looking at Australia, or a provincial level if you're looking at Canada. Ambitiously, countries and cities that have done this, and different reports that have come out glowing about these, have said it leads to about a 5% increase. So if you look at reports in Auckland, Portland, places where people are very excited about this, you're looking at 5%. That's not nothing. In the UK, it would mean another 1 million homes. But we should also recognize that it's not in itself a solution. The 2 limitations that come through are firstly, when it comes to ambition in the form of government policy and getting into finer details. In terms of ambition, this may sound obvious, but governments need to maximize the land that is available for planning reform and the new units that can be built with that planning reform. So 2 examples here worth mentioning are Seattle and Toronto. Seattle made major changes to the amount that you could build on a given lot, but it only made those changes effective on about 4% of its land. That meant that the impact that it could have on new supply was very constrained. Toronto did the opposite thing. They applied their changes to almost the entirety of the city. However, the changes that they made were minimal. They increased the amount that a lot could house from 1 unit to 4 units. Very few people are going to make use of this. Those that do are only going to be able to increase supply by 3 units. You can imagine how little that's going to impact a city of 2 to 6 million in Toronto's case. The second element when it comes to ambition is being very clear on what we mean when we say planning reform. Often these places liberalize capacity, saying theoretically you can build 10 units on a given lot, but it didn't get into the finer detail. It didn't change height requirements, so buildings have to stay the same size. It didn't change land requirements that allowed buildings to get larger. Michael Gove's recent announcement on brownfield land is a perfect example of this, where he increased the requirement that cities need to build where they fall behind on brownfield land. However, it included an exemption on character and density. So the top two complaints that NIMBYs have, they were able to raise to get out of this requirement to build more. The other element we looked at is affordability. So even in cities where planning reform does increase supply, does that affect affordability? Do the new units necessarily bring down prices or restrain them? Again, not necessarily. That doesn't mean it can't be done, but there are certain things we need to do to make it work. Firstly, there is a risk that we need to acknowledge that prices increase as a result of planning reform. This is often not talked about in the debate, and it should be much more. When you increase, so home values are largely based on land values, right? The common joke in local policy is imagine how much your home would be worth if you put it on the back of a truck. It's not, it's largely based on the land that it's on. As land value rises, so too do home prices. That's a big problem if you increase the capacity that you can build on that land. That land is going to get more expensive, and as a result, so too will homes. An SMF advisor, The Intelligent, spoke about this called Home Truths, where he points to cases where home values increased by over 100 times following certain planning liberalizations. The gamble of planning reform is that the downward pressure on prices that comes from the new supply will outweigh upward pressure on prices that comes from the value uplift. That is not at all guaranteed, but it can be through different affordability requirements. Where it fails quite badly. Cases would include New York, Chicago, Seattle, Brisbane, all of which saw prices increase following planning reform rather than decrease. In the New York case, this was particularly egregious because it generally affected ethnic minority areas. It looked at places like Harlem, where the Black community is strong, Williamsburg, where there was a Jewish population, and Chinatown, where there was a large East Asian population. Following planning reform, the amount of ethnic minorities in that area decreased substantially, and the amount of whites in that area increased substantially. Again, this doesn't mean we can never do planning reform, but we should be very conscious of the risks involved if we do it right. The report ends by calling for certain safeguards to ensure affordability. Firstly, we need to change how we define affordable housing. At the moment, the UK defines it as housing that is 20% below the market rate in that area. That means affordable housing means you paying 80% to market rate. And you can imagine high-demand areas, central London, that rate's going to be unaffordable for many. We advise a 60-30-20 rule. That would mean that someone on 60% of the median wage, so someone pretty low income, would pay 30% of their income on rent. We would apply that to 20% of units. That would help ensure affordability, especially during planning reform, which is, as I mentioned, a pretty dangerous process. Minneapolis is the perfect example of this. They combine very ambitious supply-side reforms, which have made Minneapolis at the forefront of construction permits, while at the same time introducing affordability incentives. They followed that same 60-30-20 rule and incentivized property owners to provide housing at that level for 20% of units. As a result, Minneapolis rents have increased 1% over the last 5 years. The average in the US is 30%. How we talk about affordability varies depending on what country you're talking about. In the UK, it could mean affordability requirements, it could mean the incentives that we saw in Minneapolis, or it could mean increasing local housing amounts. But as long as we're talking about affordability within the general planning reform argument, I think that's all.
Right, thanks to you very much. So, for any political fact finding issue, if you're looking at tickets to Minneapolis, that is the deal. Next up, we've got Ruby Lavinia, who's a journalist and has done lots on this kind of area. Ruby, what are your reflections on planning?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Ian. I shouldn't have read the report. That's really, really good overview. Yeah, so I'm a journalist, which means, definitely not an expert in supply side planning reform, but I guess I come with a kind of professional and personal understanding of the housing crisis. I'm a freelance journalist, so I was working at Open Democracy as political correspondent until very recently, working in Westminster. And I do a lot of reporting on the housing crisis, on overcrowding, on landlord lobbying in Westminster. I follow the bills in Westminster, such as the Renters Reform Bill, which doesn't require much following because it's going nowhere, which gives you an insight into kind of the political appetite for dealing with issues like affordability and the housing crisis. I'm also a renter of 9 years. I'm currently going through my second no-fault eviction in 2 years. This one is a revenge eviction. Also a personal experience of kind of the housing crisis in this country. I think we all agree that obviously there is a problem, there is a housing crisis that is really dire. But what does kind of this nebulous term like housing crisis really mean? When I think about it, there's an inability for people to secure and affordable housing. That is it, a home, basically, a human right. And I think when we kind of weigh up this debate, or when I kind of talk about it with people, and especially, if you're talking about planning, for example, on the one side, you have people who want to make more money, and on the other side, you have people who want a home and a human right. And I think sometimes those two things are seen as like comparable desires, and I actually don't know if they necessarily are. And I think it's important to kind of see the differences there. Another problem we have is that, in politics in Westminster, in journalism, in, a lot of the experts in the area, there isn't really a real understanding of what the housing crisis means. I will have a very privileged experience of that to an extent, but, a lot of people are homeowners, they are landlords, they are very happy to see their assets grow in value. And there really isn't that much of a kind of political will to change it, because they're not seeing that day to day on their doorsteps. They are not visiting homes of people living in, 5 people, families living in 1-bedroom flats, or, understanding what it really means to have an eviction over your head. So there really is an issue with kind of understanding and political will, I think, when it comes to dealing with like housing affordability and how you create policy that deals with that. And of course, one of the biggest Conservative Party donors, or the biggest Conservative Party donors, are house builders and developers. And so obviously there's kind of a crossover with this report and a lot of their desires, which is kind of deregulate, to kind of free up, how we build. But I think the key thing in this report that I'm really interested to chat about is the kind of affordability guidelines, and how do you allow for this kind of change in regulation. I'm reluctant to put maybe like a deregulation, like a change in regulation, a cutting of red tape, if you would buy into that, without kind of just allowing spiraling costs. That is what we have kind of historically seen. And one thing I will say when we talk about kind of how planning can help solve the housing crisis, and how building houses can be the big solution, because I think in terms of the dialogue we have a lot at the moment, that is what people say. They say, oh, we just need to build more houses, just need to build more houses. There is one issue, and I'll see if we get into this, but like it's time, and building houses takes a really long time, and most people are dealing with a housing crisis right now. And so, it's while obviously, these policies are really important, I think that's something to bear in mind when we're talking about kind of how much this can actually help a housing crisis if, a really sustainable great development takes like 8 years to get to. So thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to see what we discuss.
Absolutely, thank you. And lastly, we've got Chris Curtis, Head of Political Polling at Opinion, and Labour's parliamentary candidate for Milton Keynes North.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for pulling this report together as well. I'll talk a little bit about why I'll sort of dodge talking about some of the specific recommendations, if that's all right, just because I'm not unfortunately responsible, obviously, for writing the next Labour manifesto, but why I think this report and this evidence-based estimate has been put together is so incredibly important. So this year, hopefully this year, God knows when Rishi Sunak's going to be calling it, but this year I hope to be the first MP for Milton Keynes that was born there and grew up there. I don't know who's been to Milton Keynes. It's fantastic. Shameful if you haven't been. Please come. 30 minutes on the train from London Euston. But it's a new town. It was built by Harold Wilson's newest of the new towns, really. Built by Harold Wilson's 1960s Labour government. And there was some fantastic stories about the barriers that they had to push through. The 1960s NIMBYs, including my grandparents, that they had to push through in order to get something built. But it was a Labour government that decided that unaffordable and substandard accommodation in the UK was not acceptable, and they needed to do something about it. For me and my brother, growing up with working class parents, that gave us that Newtown promise of security, of home ownership, all of those good things, which too often is not now being offered to the next generation. And I do worry that quite often our politics lacks that sense of ambition, particularly around housing these days. And I think the thing that I find sort of most heartbreaking as somebody who grew up in that new town is now seeing our Member of Parliament trying to do absolutely everything he can in almost every piece of literature, like too many other Members of Parliament across the country, seeing their job to be, what can I block? What sort of factories or industries can I block being built in the local area, even though that will damage people's ability to get good jobs locally and damage the ability of our economy to grow. The Conservatives in Milton Keynes ran the council for a few years, and in those few years they passed new rules that made it almost impossible to build any more wind turbines anywhere in the city, which meant that, as we all know, there's now more wind turbines being built in Ukraine onshore every year than there is in the UK. So we were, uniquely in a situation to be reliant on foreign oil and gas when that oil crisis hit last year. But obviously, most importantly, we noticed this on housing. We're going through a process in Milton Keynes at the moment of planning to house building up until 2050. It's always going to be a difficult process, and it's set based on government targets. And yet, pretty much all of the Conservative literature that goes out locally is talking about ways they can block, what kind of development proposals they can block, why they think that new houses should never happen, and that opportunity that was offered to me should be blocked. This is the MP in the seat that I'm standing in runs the APPG for housing delivery and is doing anything he can to stop the delivery of any housing. This is the situation that we have in politics. Now, that's obviously the YIMBY argument, which we hear all the time. And to be honest with you, it's useful for me to spend 2 minutes making that, but for politic reasons, if nothing else, I probably don't need to convince many people in this room of the argument, of that argument. But obviously, we know that, I think the importance of this report is we know that it can't end there. There are legitimate concerns about house building, and there are legitimate concerns about planning reform. I think we need to do planning reform. We need to make sure that we're increasing the supply of housing in this country. And I also think that for too often our politics has been dominated by people that, attitudes on this question, just like so many others, sit on some kind of bell curve, and we listen far too much to the whingiest end of the bell curve and not enough to the legitimate concerns of people in the middle. So yes, build more houses, and we need to allow developers to be able to build more houses. But in return for that, we have to be thinking about what we're asking for them in return in order to make sure that the new value that is created by the building of those new houses is not just swallowed up by landowners or by profit margins of the developers. We talked in the Labour Party a little bit about the extra planning reforms that we want to do, opening up space on what we call the grey belt, which is a completely stupid, outdated planning law that clearly needs changing. And other things as well. But obviously, I do accept that we are going to need to ask developers for more in return. I think affordability is clearly a big and important part of that. But also, I think when we're doing a lot of these new building and development, we also need to think about making sure that we are getting that good infrastructure going in alongside GP surgery, schools, roads, public transport, whatever it happened to be. And also, I think quite often there are sort of slightly softer things that are left off the list with new development, making sure that what we're building is genuinely beautiful and nice, making sure that we've got good access to green spaces and greenery around the housing estates. Often that doesn't get put into the planning process because nobody gets that far down the list. It's important to make sure that the new places we are building are genuinely nice places to live with good communities for the people that move there. So I do think it's important to do that. I think this report gives us really good evidence based on the affordability side of the kind of way that we can do that. I also think that it's important though that we get better as a country at holding developers to account. So you can set whatever rules you like, but if developers can in certain circumstances feel like they can get away with not applying those rules, Angela Rain has talked a lot about this with the affordability requirements. You set the affordability requirements and then there's loopholes that mean that people can't get around them. That's clearly an issue that we need to solve as well. And I think the final issue, sort of one the penultimate point, I'm just talking the final one. There's also a massive capacity problem in the system, which often doesn't get talked about enough. It's all right discussing the rules. One of the biggest holdups is our state does not have the capacity quite often in order to implement the planning system, whatever the rules are. So we do need to make sure that we get more planning officers into the system. They just talked about hiring 300 more planning officers in local councils right across the country. We also need to make that a more desirable job that people stick with, because often you have people come into planning and then leave quite quickly to go and work for private businesses or better salaries, and that creates problems as well. So we need to be looking at increasing capacity within our planning system in order to be able to implement this, particularly if we are trying to go through this process of increasing supply. And then finally, I wrote this sort of report for the SMF recently, but I think that new towns is also quite an important part of this, bringing back, like we did with Milton Keynes, that development corporation model that allows us to build new housing alongside good local infrastructure at the same time. Big projects that have the scale in order to deliver lots of housing, including affordable housing with variety, with the green spaces as well. And also at pace. So a lot of this is the kind of things that the Labour Party has been talking about that it will do in government. And I think all of that is very important.
Great, thanks, Chris, very much. We'll be coming to your short of questions, but I'm going to use my first prerogative and ask you a follow-up question.
Yeah.
And with your opinion hats on, we've talked a lot about YIMBYs and NIMBYs and all these kinds of things. Do you think that, have you seen any evidence of that? Is the appetite in the public for puncture planning reforms with this kind of thing be popular? What are you currently seeing?
But it's sort of the point I made before, like all of these things sit on a bell curve. And too often this, I think we've all basically broadly agreed on this point, right? Like too often this debate is set up as like YIMBYs versus NIMBYs. But actually like there's this sort of NIMBY in my backyard contingent in the middle. Like people will broadly be, pretty even opinion on, do you support development in your local area? Actually, it comes down to what that development is, what it comes with. Do I feel like my children and my grandchildren are going to be able to buy that house? Is it going to be a desirable place to live? Is it? People can't get a GP appointment, and our hospitals have massive waiting lists. People are correct to be concerned about the impact. People are correct to be concerned about the impact of new developments and what we're having on the local services and local NHS. It is our responsibility to make sure that as part of the process of planning and development, we are doing enough to put people's mind at ease that if anything, these new developments are going to be improving that situation and not making it any worse. So it is actually about caring about those concerns in the middle. We haven't been doing that enough in the country. We've been listening to people too much on one very extreme end of that sort of distribution.
Okay, and Gideon really commented there about the kind of, building houses great in the long term. What about right now? Do you think that any of your recommendations you think can sort of, what would you do to help in the?
The affordability requirements can be put in. Yes, planning reform tends to take a while, especially if you want to go for more zoning. Which is basically my next problem. Zoning is going to take a really long time to get passed. You mentioned how long it takes for franchise reform to get through. But if we wanted to look at affordability requirements, that's a lot easier to pass and could have an equal effect on prices, right? Like if we wanted to bring prices down, restrain price growth, we've got two elements between supply and affordability. Supply is going to take some time, but the affordability can also drag down costs as well.
And really, when you're speaking to people on the streets facing these kind of issues, what sense do you get in terms of their call for planning, or is there an appetite?
Yeah, I think, I really liked one part of the report that spoke about, I think it quoted a a local politician saying that the way you can get people to turn up to your meetings is just say, do you dislike developments in your local area? Me too. Come on. And, you know, I think there is this incredibly strong appetite in, you know, really depends. The answer to your question is really depends who you speak to. You know, if you are speaking to that sort of older white population of homeowners in your local area, then they do not want planning. And if you are speaking to kind of, you know, a younger group of still probably reasonably affluent people who might be able to get on the housing ladder at some point, then they are. But if you're speaking to people still kind of at the lower end of kind of like the social bracket, I don't think planning even registers because, you know, in this country, we have not seen house building equaling an ability to buy houses. You know, like in my kind of adult life, the more developments you see around you are luxury flats being built, and that is not something that I could ever afford. And so I think, you know, when you speak to people who are at the sharp end of the housing crisis, they might say something like, we need to build more homes, but a lot of the time it's we need to build more social homes. You know, we need to build homes that they can actually access, and that doesn't always seem to be exactly what is necessarily meant by what we talk about planning.
But there are two things I think that we can do in the short term to improve the housing situation generally. The first is, like, as you mentioned before, we need to pass the renters reform bill. It is unacceptable that this is being ditched because, well, I assume because of the landlord lobby in Parliament and because too many Tory MPs are landlords themselves refusing to pass it. We can be passing that, and we can be making life better for private renters in this country over a very short period of time. And secondly, there are lots of people in leaseholds who are being screwed. We need to do a proper fix of the leasehold system in this country. And that is also something that we can be doing in the short term before we have the big, you know, hopefully long-term solutions to the affordability.
What about Ruby's point on social housing? Where's Labour at with that at the moment?
Yeah, we need to be building more social housing, and we need to be building more council housing.
Yeah, which I also would argue should be the same thing. That's like a real Tory misnomer, which is this like social housing is 80% affordability, but council housing is something different. And that means that, you know, whoever the housing minister this can go on the radio and say, oh yeah, we're building loads of social housing, but it's not. It's like expensive housing, and it's not council housing. So changing the language. And I would also just say, like, I mean, even if the renters reform bill went through, I don't think it's really going to do much. You know, there's without, you know, God forbid, I mentioned it, but rent controls, and you know, they are something that can come in immediately and are not a perfect fix. But, you know, they are something that can go alongside, you know, planning reform. I see some head shaking at the front here. I'm interested to see where you're from. But I think, you know, there's stronger, more radical reforms that can be put in that aren't just, you know, getting rid of Section 21 evictions, right? Because then if you hike rents, you can still evict your tenants, for example.
Do you think you would have evicted those 2 times, even if Section 21 had been missed?
Yeah, because I think my landlord would have just put up the rent and got us out, you know, like, or would have said they intended to sell it, and then there'd be no recourse to kind of chase that up. So yeah, I guess these are the things we talk about when we say how do you create planning to build more houses while also helping people like simultaneously who are struggling at the moment.
Well, that seems to be a great time to throw open to the audience. We'll take 2 or 3. If anyone's got any questions, I'm going to crank open this iPad, which apparently is going to have some online questions on it. If I can get it to work. Okay, online we've got yeah, go ahead.
Question for Gideon. My name is Morrison from the Central Cities. You spoke about sort of some reforms within the current system without switching to zoning. You also spoke a bit at the end about like a long-term switch to zoning would take a long time, but it might be more ideal. I wonder whether you could say more about like what you think the ideal would be for the UK, let's say in 10 years' time, whether or not you think that would involve zoning. And then within the current system, again, yeah, talking more immediately, what are the key things, like if you have to pick 3 mechanisms within the current system that we should do right now or as soon as possible that would increase supply?
You're at Senator City. You work with Anthony Creek.
We do, yeah.
Yeah, he's normally working. He can probably tell you a lot more about something than I can. So we spoke to a lot of different policymakers as well as academics and advocates around the world. Most of them have some form of zoning. The UK, it has a particularly non-zoning practice. Just sort of to go over the basics very quickly. Zoning basically provides a certainty, more certainty, that you will be able to build on a lot based on certain characteristics, depending on what you're building, where that lot is, and what it would be used for. I would say there is more in common between zoning and discretionary systems than people like to assume. I mean, the people we spoke to, they were always like, whether they were in the US with like very extreme zoning, whether they were in Ireland or Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all of these places that have more zoning than us, they were complaining about the same problems, same holdups, right? Amenities, blocking it, problems with affordability, problems with actually getting developers to build, even when they have the rights to build. So I have some skepticism that a pivot to zoning is worth it, considering the political capital it would take, considering the amount of change it would require, compared to what we can do. If we're talking about boosting supply, like I said, I'm in favor of planning reform, but I think that can be done within the current system. We need affordability requirements on that planning reform, but to boost supply, we can mandate that local councils have up-to-date plans that recognize long-term population trends. We can mandate that if they don't, they need to allow more densification in their areas if it wants it, or some kind of medium densification if that is more respectable to what the locals want. But I would aim more for reforms within the system that we have, rather than a pivot to zoning, which I think would take up a lot of energy without actually doing that much good.
Yeah, go ahead.
Machine was roughly that most number in the UK. Yes, we just want to get the panel's views on to what extent was building energy efficient housing and rather sustainable housing kind of on the impact or an impact on affordability of what it's built. It seems to me like a two-stage process. You have to build the housing that has to be affordable to live in. Seems like it's particularly relevant at the moment, given that the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero has consulted on things like the energy model and the future home standard, and it's going to be going to a number of different where what the affordability model funds is for housing.
Great, then you want to say that.
No, I'm not. I'm definitely not an expert on that. And I will note that the report actually mentions that it isn't focusing on kind of energy.
I can give a brief overview. Again, I'm also not an expert. It's one of those topics in the report where we say it's important, but we don't have time to go into it here. In terms of the expenses, yes, it costs a little more to build energy efficient homes. It also costs more to build sustainable. Other matter. If anyone's interested in this topic, there's a lot of people at Case working specifically on that. But you do save money in the long run. Like many green goods, it does cost more upfront, but any of those homeowners are going to be spending more if they don't do those requirements over the long term. So I would say if there's some way to funnel that money towards them upfront, potentially a subsidized loan, then you can better incentivize that and they can pay it off over the long term with the savings that they generate.
Yeah, no, that was what I was going to say as well. This is a financing question ultimately, right? Like, I mean, and the returns that you get on energy efficiency of homes, like you're talking in many cases, given prices now like 4-year, 5-year returns, it would be, it would be nuts to be not requiring a lot of these things to be built on homes, which pay for themselves back so quickly. It is a question, as much of a planning question, about how we sort finances. And it shouldn't be hard to sort out how these kind of things are financed, given that the returns can come so quickly. So I'm not saying that I've got a practical solution to you, but but just by getting the report, then yes, it's entirely possible and definitely should be being done. Whether that is a system of, it can come out, you can somehow find a way of paying for it based on the discounts on the energy bills, but then you somehow have to kind of set up a system of doing that without locking the eventual owners of the new built houses into contracts that they can't get out of, which then creates other problems. But yeah, given the payback on this, it can't be that particularly difficult problem to solve.
Hi, Ben Sabers from Public First and SMF, actually, years ago. So yeah, question for Gideon or anybody. You talked earlier about how kind of planning reform or kind of liberalising regulations could possibly lead to property price increases. You kind of used the examples, I think, in the US of where that's happened. Is that kind of linked to gentrification? Is that, and can you talk a little bit more about that dynamic and how we?
Yeah, sure. It's completely with gentrification.
Yeah.
Gentrification is kind of a loaded word, which is why I prefer to say higher prices, that sort of thing. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we saw in New York, I gave those examples, Harlem, Chinatown. That was the gentrification, right? Higher income individuals who did not previously live in the area coming in because they could afford the prices, while people who have grown up in that area, lived in their area for years, could not. It's not only in the US, though. We saw the same things in Australia. We saw the same things in British Columbia and Canada. In terms of avoiding it, not to say this over and over again, but affordability mandates are key. Whether that means social housing or some kind of mandate, housing benefit, we need those in place. The other element that we saw that I didn't mention earlier is a lot of times housing reform is done piecemeal. It's done on very specific geographies, a block or two blocks at times in the US. And that tends to have a dangerous effect because it will increase demand quite a lot in that area. If supply doesn't increase, you're going to have gentrification, and it's more dangerous when it's in that small area because it's more intense. That demand gets concentrated. Suddenly, all the developers want to go there. That doesn't happen all the time, but it's a heavier risk when planning reform is not ambitious, when it is instead looking at specific areas, which is why we recommend doing this at a local authority. You can have different rules depending on where in the local authority you're doing it, but just doing it on very small plots of land increases the risk.
At the towards the back there.
Me.
Yeah.
I've got two questions, if that's okay, so I can be a bit cheeky.
Absolutely.
I'm biasing off from ITPR. My first question was sort of building on what Chris mentioned about access to services, and I wondered whether you looked at sort of land value capture, section 106, and structure levy type questions in this report. And the second one was on the sort of affordability point and the need for council building. And I wondered if you thought about how we could use that, given current sort of financial climate, ways that we could unlock council building at the scale that the panel seems to agree that you need for this to happen. Thanks.
On land value tax, I wanted desperately to talk about it. It's too big, and it felt like it was taking away from the point. Although not many examples in the world, so it didn't fit with this project. Hoping to do it in future. I mentioned Liam Halligan before. He's an advisor here. He has an excellent book on it called Home Proofs if you're interested. On raising funds for social housing, yeah, we talked about it in a few. There's a report that's specifically on social housing co-ops that Jane, my colleague Neve, wrote. In terms of building money for that, there's a lot of ways you could do it. Reforming the tax system is critical, especially how we tax property here, which is completely anachronistic and completely different from what other countries do in terms of council tax. So we recommended reforming that. We recommended levying new taxes, which we called housing sin taxes, on practices like foreign buyers, vacant homes, house flipping. That would also raise money. And lastly, just reforming the tax system more generally. We need to recognize that housing, social housing in particular, is an asset for a council, not a liability. Over the long term, these will pay off. Over the medium term, these will pay off. But they need to have the ability to make those investments in order to get that return.
Ruby, any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the subject of sort of council building is really interesting. I think it's not obviously like money is the biggest issue, and just councils and not facing like ridiculous cuts. as they have since 2010, is core to that. But there's also a kind of will issue, and this is also picked up in the report, which is that if you are kind of funding developments that aren't very popular, maybe initially, that might not matter to a local MP, but it's probably going to matter to a local councillor, where like a small minority of angry people are their votes. And so I think money is obviously probably the biggest part of that, but then there's also the kind of will at kind of like a local council level that's really important.
Do you think Labour will be willing to put that bill for social housing in principle?
Well, you have to talk about the flip side of this, which is the amount of money that we are spending as a country on housing debt, which is dramatic amount and only going to continue to go up. And the idea that we're paying so much taxpayers' hard-earned money to basically into the pockets of private landlords because we have failed as a nation to build enough council housing and social housing, affordable housing more generally over the past few years is negligent, and we need to make sure that we do not continue to make those mistakes in the decades to come because we just can't afford to.
Yeah. Is rent control a solution? If so, has it been tried elsewhere, like Scotland? And do you consider that to be a success?
Ruby, any thoughts on?
Yeah, it's perfect. No issues. No, I mean, look, obviously it's not the only solution. And, what you see in Scotland where you have kind of the policy ending and then landlords, about to hike rents up massively because they're terrified of it coming in again and not having an opportunity to do that, or the kind of outer edges of that where they're not involved in that kind of like remit, being able to push rents up massively. It has to be a really widespread thing, I think, and it also has to be. And when I say rent controls, I don't mean like rent caps. It doesn't have to be like it can't go above a certain amount. It's usually in terms of it could be linked to RPI. That's obviously quite problematic. But you look at a lot of regulations that have come into let's say the renting space. I know we're talking about planning and there has been a renting report, so we don't need to go too far into that. But if you look at things like HMO licensing, for example, something that's meant to really improve private renting in this country. Without rent controls, that's a real issue because what you find, and what I have found looking for properties, is that if you're looking for three shared housing that requires an HMO license, the cost of the HMO license just immediately gets passed on to the renter. And so all those houses are really expensive, or they just say we're only renting to two people or a family. So there's lots of, I think, policies that you can introduce in this country that if you don't put alongside kind of rent controls or something to regulate that, if anyone has a better idea, let me know. That you just see kind of like the issue continue.
What do you think of the sort of rent dispute mechanisms that are currently available? There is,
they're non-existent. There is no rent dispute mechanism. Like you can, I mean, there is technically, but in reality, that there isn't. People are not going. Basically, I think it has to be a reasonable rent increase, and I mean, like, what is a reasonable rent increase? How do you define that? If it is inflation, then okay, cool. Putting it up by 8% is still a lot. And there is, renters a lot of the time they are young, they have families, they have on a lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, they don't have time to kind of go to a small claims court or housing court, or I don't know exactly which court it will go to deal with your rent issue, because they know they just also lose. So there is no mechanism for that. And I think, obviously, having a legal system that has more resources, so things like that can be pursued, and actually having a real way to challenge it and having like real control over it would be great.
Chris, so Sadiq Khan's called for rent controls in London, or at least the power to do so. Do you think that's right?
Well, I take all of the criticism of rent controls and have never massively been in favour of it myself. But I think you have to come at this from a slightly different position as well. Assuming what we need to have a big reform of the renters market, and we need to end no fault evictions. Now, if you end no fault evictions, but you don't have a legitimate mechanism in place to stop landlords just hiking up the prices in order to do a no-fault eviction through the back door, then the change makes absolutely no difference. So you are going to have controls and restrictions in place there anyway. And then the question therefore becomes, how do you do that practically in a way that causes the fewest problems? So I broadly, take all of the legitimate criticism that exists of rent controls, but you are going to have a mechanism in order to, at the very least, do that. Ultimately, the best way of making housing more affordable for renters and for homeowners in this country, though, is not by controlling prices, by increasing the supply. And that's always going to be an important task.
A handful at the back there. Let's
James Riding from Inside Housing. We often hear about how the British housing market is dominated by big volume house builders. Did you find any examples in other places that have tried planning reform as to whether the reform increases SME builders or self-build or custom build, that sort of thing? And also for Ruby, why did your landlord want revenge?
Also, it just seems like if you're going to try and do revenge on someone, maybe someone who's a journalist.
I don't tell I'm a housing journalist. Right.
I can do the last one question. Were there more SME builders? In general, there were less. Planning reform tends to favor those who can build larger. It's up for debate whether that's good or bad. I think it's better to have as diverse a market as you can. But when you are suddenly saying you used to be able to, build an extra floor on your house, now you can build a multiplex building, it's going to decrease the market size.
The story of my revenge eviction is that our landlord wanted to visit the property quite a lot and send sort of electricians and plumbers and stuff around quite frequently, which...
Did you have problems with your electricity?
No problems. And at the beginning, we were like, okay, sure. Me and my husband's work, and it was quite challenging to sort of facilitate that in the middle of the day, but we kind of went along with it at the beginning. And then after a while, it just became over very small things. So they wanted to pin something new on the corkboard. Could they come around? They wanted to measure the insulation in the attic. Could they come around? So we sort of said after a while, like, no. And then the final straw came when they wanted to check the fire alarm and the fire safety lighting, emergency lighting, which was fine. They came around, and then 3 weeks later we got an email saying, can we come around and check the fire alarm and lighting? And we said, oh, that's really weird. We just had someone. And she said, oh no, I think you actually need to do it every 5 weeks. And I was like, if you could let me know which legislation requires that, it would be great to know. Because I have no idea. But I mean, if anyone knows about legislation that requires you to do that, let me know. But I feel like, both landlords and tenants would go crazy if that was actually legislation. And then I think the final issue was that I cited my rights under my contract, which is the quiet enjoyment of my home, which is, at the end of the day, what you're entitled to as a renter. And then she just decided to get us out of our contract because she was concerned that we didn't want people coming around. And she had done everything by the book, and so we couldn't resist it, I mean, we could have resisted it illegally, but we couldn't resist it legally. She'd given us all the legislation required stuff. So yeah.
Can I just make another pitch? This was a point that I picked up on in the essay I read for SNF on new towns, and one of the benefits of that was that it does allow you to have the big sites. And sure, the big sites are mostly going to be done by the larger house builders, but you can set aside, and they did in Milton Keynes, plots and places for SME house builders and for self-build as well. Those places still don't exist today. Now that's obviously fantastic for the diversity of the industry, but also it's fantastic for the place itself that you're building, because it then means that you can build somewhere with more interesting design, with more variety. So it is yet another argument for why we do need to build that next generation of new towns that Kia's been talking about.
I guess the natural follow-up to that, Chris, is where. You know, and in particular, you just see like, by the coast, you know, is there those particular spots that you have in mind, or
Well,
does it still decide?
There's a lot more work that needs to be done in order to answer that question, right? And like far more resource than I possibly have than picking sites on a map. But ultimately, you know, you need to be thinking about like the transport links that are into the capital. You know, you want these places to be economic hubs in and of themselves. But actually, in order to be economic hubs in and of themselves, they still need to have good transport links in and out of the capital. You've got to think about the capacity for it to be built locally, but also the capacity of those transport links in and out of the city. So lots of these things to think about and to be done. You've got to necessarily just like start whacking crosses on a map to do it. But you just have to look at what's feasible and then pick the sites that are best for that. Well, I don't have an answer, but you first acknowledge you need to do it, and then you look at the feasibility of sites and decide which one's the best.
Great question, everyone.
I have a question for Chris on the capacity issue in the planning system.
Yeah.
And more like, is it an issue of churn, either that people are skilled and are just leaving for higher paid jobs, or is it another area where we have a skills shortage and we need to actually train more people? What's the bigger issue with capacity there?
I'm not an expert in the industry, so I can't necessarily speak to that. I think there's definitely a churn issue, but also I think that, you know, even if councils are operating at councils and authorities are operating at the ability of maximum number of planners, at the moment that budget probably still isn't enough. So even if you've got a massive, fantastic pipeline of people coming in, we still need to increase the number of people that are employed in planning, particularly if we want to be doing more.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Richard Lemon. I'm a town planner by profession, taking a career break, but previously worked for a developer and before that a planning consultant. Question for Gideon, if I may. If I understood you correctly, one of your recommendations is that we have local plans mandated. Is that right?
Yeah, the government set targets that local planners would have to abide by, but they would be able to choose how they do so.
So local plans as we have them now would have to be in place by a given time. Is that
Yeah?
But don't we have that already?
They're waiting on it.
I know. Already required to put them in place, and there are penalties if they don't. But I don't understand what's new.
And you could try to funding. I don't really focus on it. To be honest, what the point is to figure out how to get local planners to update their plans and to integrate into those plans long-term population projections, right? You could tie that to social housing funding, you could tie that to any number of things, but you want to get them to upgrade that. I think it's about 2/3 that are now behind.
Yeah. But I mean, there are good reasons for that. I mean, number one, there isn't the resource in local authorities to do that. Number two, the system is shifting underneath the sands of local authority planners all the time because the national framework is changing. And number three, it's politically unpalatable to put plans in place sometimes. It's much easier just to do nothing and wait for developers to come along, go down the appeal route and get planning permission through planning appeals. I mean, that's the reality. So you can mandate things that you like, but there are other forces at play here.
I'm not sure it would be politically unpalatable. Like you were talking about.
The point I'm going for now is definitely, I say this as somebody who's running for election as a Labour Party candidate in a constituency that is currently doing the right thing and going through this process. You know, I've got a Labour-run local authority in Milton Keynes that is going through the right thing and doing this process. And on the front of every single Conservative Party leaflet that's going out in the constituency, they are having a go at the Labour Council for doing the right thing, setting the target and trying to do planning. I think that's shameful. Well, it's shameful that the Conservative government puts these targets on local authorities and then tries to campaign against them and go through that process of campaigning against them. And we all know if we didn't go through that process of doing the plan, things would end up much worse in the long run with crap developments because developers have been able to get through on appeal. But making that argument, and God knows I tried to make that argument, making that argument is very difficult. So we do need to find a way of getting through this in a more politically palatable way that doesn't cause those problems. I don't have a solution to it, but I think what you should all do is go and have a go at Conservative MPs that are trying to make this in the first place.
Okay.
CDI, I'm a grants manager at Trust for London. We're an organisation with a mission around poverty in London. And my question to the panel is, who or where do you think should be the priority in terms of boosting supply and affordability?
So you're saying
What do you mean by who or where?
Whether who in terms of are there particular groups that you would wish to aim at in terms of them getting the new affordable homes, or where in the context of discussions about levelling up and London versus not London?
Any thoughts on that?
We didn't look into demographics specifically. In terms of where you target areas of high demand, that includes both London, but also areas which are continuing to see high demand and not supply. Groundworks on rural areas are declining of demand, as are urban areas in the north and Midlands. Really what you want is a lot of funding going towards social housing being adequately spread out. In terms of which demographics you would target to benefit from those social houses, I'm not sure. I have that information.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the idea is hopefully you get to a point where you don't have to be kind of picking and choosing who you give the house to and all the groups that you don't give the house to, you know. If we can be radical and imaginative and dream big, we can hope for a situation in the UK where access to housing is good enough that you don't necessarily ask that question. I understand where you are.
Any questions from online? Quite simply, is the green belt a good thing? Who wants to take that hot potato? Ruby?
No. Is my answer. I mean, you know, I grew up in London. I've always lived in London. I'm from an urban area, so I guess I'm less sympathetic to arguments that there are certain areas that are, you know, above housing. You know, I think there is obviously an argument to have some green areas. You know, I think London is also a very green space, for example, not obviously it's not like parts of the green belt. Yeah, we do have to work out our relationship to the green belt and how we understand kind of pretty nice areas of the UK. Because at the end of the day, you know, to an extent, people having homes is probably nicer than beautiful rolling hills for miles behind us.
I am also in favor of building on the green belt, but I would be very careful about what we mean by building and where. Oftentimes this gets into a sort of yes/no debate, which I think is sort of unhelpful. Once again, planning reform only works where there is demand. In a lot of parts of the green belt, you are not going to have demand for housing. Those are parts with no transport access, or even if they have transport access, too long to get into the city. So I would be very careful where we reform and how much we do, because more of that demand is going to be in already dense areas. And if you can promote that density rather than that sprawl, that's certainly preferable.
It's interesting in Liam Halligan's book, talking about just how much the green belt's kind of grown in the last few decades. It's doubled since the 70s or the 80s or something. Any views on the green belt?
Yeah, I mean, the houses should be built in the places where houses are best to be built. So the question of any planning rule or regulation or restriction or anything is it meaning that properties are being built in the places where they're best to be built, and the green belt as is currently defined is stopping building in places where we need to build. And you know, arguably meaning, you know, in a sort of zero-sum game system, it would therefore mean that more houses are being built where they shouldn't. It's not because we need to increase the total supply. If we were building the right number of houses, the current setup is not optimum for allocating where those houses should be. So the green belt, in its current definition, is clearly not the best way of setting up a system that defines where we should and shouldn't be built. I think it's like, right, the thing the green belt's got going for it is its name, and everybody thinks that green field near them must be green belt because they both green. And that's not true. And again, you come back to looking at literature and elections, you have people campaigning to save the green belt in places that don't have a bloody green belt. That's how mad it is. So you know, and that's always the difficulty of a politician coming out and saying we need to look at the green belt. Everybody's like, oh, that lovely park near me. What they want to build on that, and it's making that clear. And like you were saying before, you know, I'm a passionate supporter of new developments being built with green spaces, and you know, green generally being involved in that project like it was in the beginning. But it is about just moving that link away between the green belt and those nice green areas, which clearly we should.
Masterclass and branding. On the flip side of that, we have the brown belt.
And now we've got the grey belt as well. So we're trying to define the bit of it. That's the new masterclass in branding, trying to redefine those crap bits of the green belt. Which clearly should be done as the green.
So with some rebranding going on. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Brad from T Curry. So obviously we've got a slightly different view of the green belt, and I think from the panel it seems that there's not full understanding of what it's there for.
Yeah.
But thinking about the boosting housing supply and affordability, I think there's a concern that you're saying let's just build and let's have everyone as a homeowner rather, and then you lose all of these green spaces, and you're saying you want to build in your new developments, you want there to be green spaces, but then how do you keep them protected if you're more than happy to build all over them? And if there's not enough social housing being delivered, which in rural areas, I think last year there was 3,000 social homes built. How, if everybody is to own a home and it's affordability, and I'm 100% in agreement that we need to redefine what affordable is, so it is actually affordable to people. But if it's everyone is affordable to buy, we're then just going to build over everything, and there won't be any green spaces, whether it's green belt or not, left, because we're just going to keep building, because everybody has the right to own a home. We have a right to a safe space to live in. Obviously that's true, but if everybody has to own their own home, we are going to run out of land. And I think social housing is the more beneficial way to ensure that the housing supply stays, because if it's social house, council house, same thing, that then stays in the community for a longer term. We then also need to work on the right to buy scheme, because houses being built and then lost to that, and then we just need to keep building and building and building, and then at what would we stop building when we run out of land and there's nothing back? That was your question. What do you think of it?
There's some really interesting work being done at the New Economics Foundation on most of this work is setting the floor really about how many homes should be built at a minimum. It's not like we find out that's what we're talking about. Neff is talking more what you're saying, setting a ceiling on how much is too much. I would talk to them and everyone.
I don't think everyone should be a homeowner. I don't think any of these comments I've made or my beliefs on housing would agree with that anyway. I mean, lots of people do want to own homes, but they're just general. It doesn't sort of matter if you're a renter or you're a homeowner in this country. If you've got more demand for housing than supply of housing, which we do, it's going to end up becoming unaffordable. So we need to increase supply of housing. That doesn't mean building everywhere. That means building in the places that are best to be built on. And the sort of broad point is, yes, I mean, green spaces within urban areas, green spaces people like should be protected. And, you know, I'm in favour of house building, but I would lay down in front of the bulldozers in my constituency in order to protect some of the fantastic green spaces we have in that city. But it is a case of making the argument that yes, we need more house building. Yes, it needs to be done in the right places. Yes, there shouldn't be too much of it anywhere else. But like, the argument in my mind that we need more supply of housing in this country is pretty settled. We need a higher supply of housing, and housing is going to continue to become unaffordable. Growth in this country is going to be restricted. We are going to create real difficulties for the next generation unless this is a problem that we go out there and fix.
Yeah,
Hi, Scott, Brett Blue. How do you think the planning system should balance the building up versus building out? Because it seems like you obviously need a bit of both. You know, if you're younger or older, a smaller place in a denser area might be the way to go. But there's also, and you know, from an infrastructure planning point of view, that's obviously preferable. But there's also a really strong preference, and there has been for decades, for sort of detached or sort of more of a place with a yard and some land, and that's also potentially more conducive for raising children. So, do we sort of have an idea about, you know, exactly where the balance should be and how we should go about that?
Okay. So there's really interesting poll now. I don't know if you guys did. There's recently over the last few months on whether with how many British households would accept a medium rise apartment over a flat if it was more affordable. And the vast majority would. I don't think we are accurately representing current opinion when we say everybody wants a detached house. I wouldn't say I want a detached house necessarily. I wouldn't say I need a front yard. In other countries, particularly the US, but also in Australia and Canada, apartment style flats, so those in high rises, you may own them, you may rent them, maybe social. But that size and that style is far more acceptable, and it's been politically palatable as well. So I wouldn't say it's so much a trade-off between the two. I would favor building more flats upwards. That said, I don't really think that there is as much demand as we usually assume for those front lawn white picket fence style.
Got one last question here from online. I don't know how controversial it was going to be, but there is a panel made of recent suggestions to encourage building of golf courses. Probably some golfers in the room. Chris, what would you say?
We should be, there's a lot of golf courses. How do I get away with dodging this question? You need to. Let's go. Okay, here's how I get away with dodging this question. Right. It is shameful that we keep finding so much extra land in this country to build extra golf courses on, and not enough extra land in this country to build new houses on, particularly in and around London. And we need to make sure that we flip that in the decades to come.
Okay, for a reversal of golf course growth, rather than necessarily. That's a good time. Yeah. Really?
I mean, I guess it was what Gideon was saying, golf courses in areas where houses need to be built should be built on, but there are obviously golf courses in areas where it wouldn't be useful to have houses. I think on the whole, though, if you look at kind of cost of golf courses, are a lot cheaper than like rents, and so like to put them there. I think on the whole, probably build them, but only if it was actually useful to have houses there.
There's 94 golf courses in London. I feel like we can do so.
Okay, well, a question back.
Not so much question observation that you could comfortably hit low renewable targets if you use certain amount of the land to get it centered on the golf courses. So there's more than one valuable use for.
You can, the mini golf ones where you hit the wind fence for it. Just build that into the golf courses, but with sounds of bigger scale.
Big development roads and options.
Can I ask Gideon one more question about your recommendations on affordability? And forgive me, I haven't read your report yet, so I'm asking these questions blind. But are you suggesting that the amount of affordable housing overall should increase when you're talking about the different proportions?
Yes. So both how we define affordability should increase, because at the moment it's ridiculous. And the amount of affordable housing we're building should increase as a proportion of total stock.
And who that cost? The public sector or the developers?
So there's three options, right? You could have more social housing, which I favor because local councils are eventually paid off. You could have local housing allowance, housing benefit increase, but as we talked about, that's very significant cost with no real return. Or you could have tax incentives for the private sector to do so. Minneapolis has been extremely successful with tax incentives. They need to be enough that the private sector actually wants to do them. In a lot of cities, you see that they're not enough, and the private sector prefers to just, we're just going to go sector homes and pay the taxes at market rates. But any one of those three.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. Because at the moment, developers pay the lion's share of affordable housing, and many would say big bad developers make loads of money, and they often do, but it's also incredibly risky developing houses. And you get it wrong, you get it completely wrong sometimes. So, and the costs on developers at the moment are pretty staggering in terms of affordable housing, biodiversity net gain, quite rightly, 2 staircases and tall buildings. Now, all of this stuff is absolutely right, and they should be contributing towards it, paying for it. But the more and more you add a burden to them, the less and less housing they are willing and able to deliver. So there's a balance somewhere. So I'm pleased to hear you talk about other means of delivering, incentivizing it.
Yeah, I'm in favor of local councils doing it. Although I would add one more thing on Minneapolis, which has been really fascinating. The demand stimulated for new affordable housing has paid off in the sense that they're still making a profit on the new homes, admittedly less than what they make at market rates. But they have set it at a correct rate so that they are still incentivized to do so, but the flats that they're renting are truly affordable.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. Thanks.
We're going to close by going back to our panelists and just having any last observations or reflections on Chris, any final thoughts?
No, I think it broadly comes back. We do need to get out of this framing of NIMBY versus YIMBY in a lot of these debates. I think the argument, I hope the argument is mostly settled on the importance of increasing supply. In Britain, the question is how we do it, how we make sure that we get as much as we possibly can back in return for this. That is not the case of just ripping up the rules on planning and hoping for the best. It is about, yes, making it easier for the developers to build in all the ways we do. That's the rules, that's the planning system, that's actually just making the entire culture of the way the UK state works change quite dramatically. But in return for that, we do need to ask for a lot more in return. I think that, you know, that's got to be the focus of all of the solutions. That's got to be the focus of the debate on housing.
Okay, thanks. Ruby?
I guess I would just caution with ever ending up saying that just building houses will solve things, you know, and I think that, and that's come up in the discussion with Greenbelt or affordability, you know, I don't think that your and end all the solution. And you know, just on the subject we just talked about flats versus, you know, terrace houses. I was recently in Berlin, so boring people housing things talk about Germany and Berlin. You know, if you are living in a beautiful large flat with 2 balconies, then people don't mind living in those flats. But a lot of the flats I've seen in new builds in the UK are horrible and barely have a window, you know. And so really it's not always just a question of like this versus that. It's like, how do you design it? How do you make it actually appropriate for people to live in? And those are just one part of the nuances. And then yeah, big up rent controls. That's
just nothing that has to be been said already. The current target is 300,000 from labor, 300,000 homes built per year. That's likely not going to be hit by planning reform alone. Optimistically, planning reform will increase supply by 5%, that construction 5%. It's not enough on its own to hit 300,000, and 300,000 is not enough on its own to bring down prices or restrain them at all. So what we need alongside that new supply is affordability, which can exponentially increase the effect that we have on housing.
Okay, thank you to the panel. Thank you all for coming, for your questions. If you want to learn any more about housing, we have 5 reports, many pages for you to digest, and stay tuned for one topic. Yeah, thank you very much.